What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Stamina Templar two-handed build here in Scalebreaker. So I've kind of said this quite a lot in other two-handed builds, but generally speaking, two-handed builds will not be pulling the same amount of single target DPS as dual-wield builds, and that's just because the nature of the skill line itself. Two-handed builds just don't have the same amount of crit chance, they don't provide the same sort of passives that a dual-wield build would be able to get. And so they end up falling a little bit short in the single target department. Where they make up for that though is in their cleave potential. So in terms of AoE DPS, two-handed builds do have a higher potential ceiling than dual-wield builds. And that's mainly because of two abilities, Carve and Reverse Slice, which we're going over in a little bit here. Now, again, I do want to mention here that this build video is not going to be going over things like gear, CPs, or any sort of character sheet sort of things. Anything that's generic to an overall build will be covered in a separate video, which should be popping up right about now in the upper right hand corner. So if you want, you can pause this video, go check out that video to look at what gear I am using for this particular build, as well as the general CPs, and then come back to this video to take a look at the skills and rotations. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here. So in terms of skills, this was actually pretty difficult to get correct for me. I tried out quite a few different combinations on the front bar, and they all seemed to work pretty decently well. They were all within like 1 to 2k DPS of each other. But this is ultimately what I ended up with. But of course, like I said, tried out a lot of different combinations, and they all ended up doing fairly decently well. So I will be going over some of those different combinations and why you would use them, when you would use them, etc. So on our front bar here, we have Biting Jabs. This is still going to be our primary spammable for a majority of the fight. This is still a very powerful spammable here. So definitely don't want to lose it. I tried out Wrecking Blow, but it didn't do quite as well as Biting Jabs did. And that's partly because Biting Jabs does end up proccing the Burning Light passive, which does help out our overall DPS. The only way you'd be able to get the Burning Light passive if you were not running Biting Jabs would be to run Blazing Spear instead, which doesn't do quite as much damage. So overall, Biting Jabs is still going to be your main spammable for the majority of the fight. Next we have Carve. And at this point I do want to point out that there is the other morph of Cleave, known as Brawler. So Carve will give you more DPS because it does have that bleed associated with it. Brawler, on the other hand, will give you better survivability because it provides an additional damage shield. So you can see here that we're already at about 5k for a damage shield, but if you hit an enemy, you get an additional 50% up to 300% for a total of 6 enemies hit. So you can get up to I believe it would be a 20k damage shield if you hit 6 enemies. So think about trash fights in trials or in dungeons. You could very easily get the 20k damage shield, which would make you quite survivable in trash fights. So that's really where things shine. In addition, you could also just run Brawler as your spammable. Obviously, as a Stamina Templar, you also have Jabs as well. But Brawler could be used as a spammable in these trash fights as well. You could also use Carve, of course, and apply that bleed to everything you manage to hit as well. So that's kind of one of the reasons why, again, two-handed builds have better AoE potential. Our second ability is, or I should say our third ability is going to be Executioner, and this is going to be our Execute ability. So when we reach around 25% health, we swap over from Biting Jabs to Executioner. Now just like Carve, I want to point out the other morph, Reverse Slice, also has its uses as well. Executioner will give you raw single target DPS. It deals 400% more damage compared to 300% from Reverse Slice. However, Reverse Slice does have a splash component behind it. Other enemies nearby take 78% of the damage inflicted to the primary target. And so, if you are smart about who you're hitting with Reverse Slice, you have the potential to deal some incredible amounts of splash damage with Reverse Slice. Hit the enemy that's almost dead, and you have an incredibly powerful splash with Reverse Slice. It's a 5-meter radius, which is actually quite noticeable. So again, this contributes to how the increased ceiling, AoE DPS ceiling, of two-handed builds compared to dual-wield builds here. Next we have Power of the Light. They did fix the bug where Power of the Light might not go off in high damage scenarios, so you still definitely want to run this ability here. You could potentially replace this with a different ability. Typically speaking, it'll be a fighter skilled ability. More on that in a little bit here. Power of the Light does provide that minor fracture, minor breach, so if you don't have a Templar healer, really good to include Power of the Light here. Then we have Barb Trap for the Minor Force. and plus Dawnbreaker for the additional 3% weapon damage. Now for our back bar, Soothing Trap, Poison Injection, Arrow Barrage, Restoring Focus. We have Barbed Trap again, so you can swap this ability out for a different ability if you so prefer. Then Crescent Sweep, this is going to be our primary. Oh, we don't want Crescent Sweep, we want the other morph. Quickly remorph that here. We want the other morph, which through here, the Empowering Sweep. So you want Empowering Sweep, not Crescent Sweep, that was my mistake there. So this would be the main ultimate that you would be using. So in terms of other abilities, you could run instead a few abilities. So like I said, Power of the Light, not really necessary if you already have like a Templar healer running Power of the Light. It's usually going to be easier for the healer to run it rather than you. Mainly because because we're running Arrow Barrage instead of Endless Hail and did change the duration on these moves, no longer quite as easy to maintain as good uptime on Power of the Light unless you really kind of focus your rotation around Power of the Light, which is possible, but it will be a little bit more difficult and a lot more micromanagement involved in that sort of rotation here. So if you're not running Power of the Light, you could run Radiant Ward for a damage shield. Stamina Templars are unique in the fact that do have a relatively decent, it's not going to be great, but it's still okay, a damage shield that you can use as a Stamina DPS, so one potential option there. You can also run Blazing Spear, which will help proc Burning Light, and as well as provide a synergy to help improve overall sustain by giving out some more resources. Just two potential options here if you'd like. I personally, if you're going to run one of these abilities, I run Blazing Spear on the back bar and then run Blazing Shield or Radiant Ward on the front bar here, but it's kind of up to you where you want to place them. And then you have under Restoring Light, the other morph here, you would use Ritual of Retribution rather than Extended Ritual. The damage is okay, it's not the greatest, especially because it is magic damage, so it doesn't scale off of your CP. The main reason why you use Ritual Retribution is not only does it deal damage, it also heals, and it provides a Purify synergy, so just another additional synergy for the tank to use, as well as your DPS to use, to help proc Lokkestiiz and other things like that. So generally speaking, a pretty decent option if you want to run a different ability on your back bar instead of Barbed Trap. Also run Repentance, which is really great in trash fights. So if you need additional sustain, you can just run Repentance and get some stamina back whenever you finish a trash fight. Really decent, really awesome. It also helps as an additional sort of AoE heal as well. But you, generally speaking, won't be using this on boss fights unless you know there will be ads and lots of ads for you to Repentance. So Stamina Templars here, you see, do have quite a few options when it comes to class abilities to kind of switch out here. Or we talked about the various two-handed abilities you could run, either of the other two morphs here. If you need Major Evasion, you can run Elude or Shuffle. Both of these do have their uses, so Shuffle gives you immunity to snares and mobilizations. Elude has a longer duration and gives you Major Expedition as well. Major Evasion is actually a very good damage mitigation bonus here. It reduces the amount of damage you take from AoE attacks by 25%. A lot of abilities actually count as AoE attacks, so it actually does do quite a bit of damage mitigation here. So I definitely recommend picking this up if you're looking for a very good source of damage mitigation. And then you can place any of these Fire Guild abilities here in place of Power of the Light as well. You get the 3% additional weapon damage from the Slayer bonus, and each of them have their own uses. So for example, Silver Shards is sort of an AoE, you can use Silver Leash if you want to help chain things in. Ring of Preservation has a pretty decent heal as well as additional damage mitigation through minor protection, very useful. Camouflaged Hunter might be useful in order to get that minor berserk whenever you're attacking something from the flank. Some situationally useful here, Camouflage Hunter, but if you're running something like, let's say you're running the Portal group on Nagintas in Sunspire, this is potentially very useful downstairs, just because you just need to flank something and you get the minor berserk here. So pretty decent options there. Then Shadow Soak on the Northern line, if you have any bow builds, the actual ability itself does deal a pretty decent amount of damage. The synergy has gotten nerfed a few times, but it's still essentially free damage if you can activate the synergy, so it's always welcome to have that there. Then for our self-heal, I'd recommend running Echoing Vigor instead of Resolving Vigor, but you can pick whichever one you want. Both of them pretty much do the exact same healing done per second, just Resolving Vigor is over 4 seconds, so it's more bursty compared to Echoing Vigor. Difference is Echoing Vigor heals other people, and you can also be healed by other people's Echoing Vigors, and they do stack on each other. So there's the potential, if you have many stamina DPS, to just everybody run Echoing Vigor and you get a bunch of Vigor ticks going. So that's why I recommend running Echoing Vigor. The heal per second done is pretty much unchanged. It's less bursty, yes, but you do have the potential to provide some additional healing to everybody, and you can also receive additional healing as well. Of course, if you want to be selfish, you could just run Resolving Vigor, but then you'd end up being selfish. But that's pretty much all of the additional skills that you might want to replace here. So again, here on the front bar, I found that you definitely want to keep Biting Jabs, Carve, Executioner, and Barbed Trap, but you can swap out Power of the Light if you feel like you don't need to run it. And then on the back bar, you can always replace Barbed Trap for something else, or if you feel like you don't need additional sustain from Restoring Focus, you can replace that. But generally speaking, I don't recommend dropping Restoring Focus. Not just because it's the sustain, but also because of the survivability. It's a major ward, major resolve, and if you're within the room, it gets boosted even more. That does help out survivability, which is actually fairly useful. So I personally don't recommend dropping Restoring Focus, but you certainly can if you feel like you don't need the survivability and you don't need the sustain. Alright, so that's all said and done. Now about the rotation. So I mentioned this briefly earlier, but because of the change to the duration to Arrow Barrage, it's a little bit trickier to maintain 100% uptime on Power of the Light. In previous builds where we were using Power of the Light, we were able to get it off once in the beginning of our rotation, our front rotation, then once at the end of our rotation. That's because we were running Endless Hail, which had a 16-second duration, or I should say 12-second duration. They buffed the duration by 2 seconds, so if we were to run Endless Hail, we would have a 14-second duration, 2-second windup, 12-second duration. Instead, we have to use Arrow Barrage, which is a little bit stronger than Endless Hail now, and so that has a 10-second duration, 2-second windup, 8-second duration, damage duration. And so it's a little bit trickier now to maintain the full Power of Light uptime. While it's still possible to do so, you would have to center your rotation around maintaining that Power of the Light, which is going to result in more micromanagement, and generally speaking, it's going to be a little bit less DPS. So if you are running Power of the Light, anticipate having, generally speaking, a little bit less Power of the Light uptime here. So for this particular of rotations, I'll show you what it looks like with Power of the Light, and I'll show you what it looks like without Power of the Light. It's obviously not that big of a change if you're dropping Power of the Light. The back rotation remains the same no matter what, though. So you always start off with Focus, Trap, if you're running Trap on the back bar. And you spend the time running Jabs here. Now, because Jab does have a channel, you cannot use Maarselok while you're jabbing, otherwise you will end up interrupting your jabs. And that'll usually end up with a DPS loss. So you'll typically do Carve or Power of the Light and then do Maarselok and then just run jabs until you have to go back to your back bar here. See here that if I were to wait for Power of the Light to run out entirely, I would end up having some downtime on my back bar dots, and that, generally speaking, is going to be a DPS loss. So, rather than centering our rotation around Power of the Light, instead we'll be going over. Instead, we'll kind of be just looking at our back bar dots here. You see here that lined up well here, but this next Power of the Light explosion is not going to line up as well. You can see here that the Power of the Light explosion is not going to go off before we can go into our back bar. So we have some downtime on Power of the Light now. That's not that big of a deal, mainly because they did buff the duration of Minor Fracture and Minor Breach up to 9 seconds, so it's not as big of a deal, but you will not be basically going explosion, 6 seconds explosion, recast, explosion, etc. So you'll have, generally speaking, a little fewer Power of the Light casts in this particular patch than you would have in 2 or 3 patches ago. Now, when we get to the execute range here, which is around 25 to 20%, instead of running Biting Jabs, swap over to Executioner. Not that big of a difference here. And then obviously, if you're not running Power of the Light, if instead you're running, for example, a fighter skill ability like Ring of Preservation, you don't have to worry about Power of the Light, so instead you would just do Carve, Bash, and then just do into jabs or Executioner, depending on where you are in terms of health. But that's pretty much how the rotation is going to go. So I would probably label this as sort of a quasi-dynamic rotation here, just because you're not really going to be having the same order on the front bar all the time. Back bar rotation is going to pretty much remain the same. You're just alternating between Trap or Restoring Focus, depending on which one needs to be recast. If you have Barb Trap double bar like I do here, you can place it on the front bar or the back bar whenever it seems to run out. It doesn't really matter too much here. But Restoring Focus will be cast every 2 seconds. As to when you want to use Empowering Sweep, I generally like to use it and just bar swap out of it. So I use it last in my back bar rotation and just bar swap out of it. I also sometimes do the ultimates, so I do Empowering Sweep, then Poison Injection, and then bar swap cancel out of Poison Injection. Kind of up to you how you want to do it. So either Poison Injection ultimate swap or ultimate Poison Injection swap. Up to you kind of how you want to order that around. So now we're going to go do a 20 million parse so you guys get an idea of how much DPS we're able to pull and do a good cross-class comparison. So we are running parse food here, so that way we can get that accurate cross-class comparison here. And again, we do not anticipate seeing the same level of single target DPS. Where two-handed builds really shine is in the increased ceiling of your AoE DPS. So this is just to kind of give you guys a look into 1, the rotation, and 2, the amount of single target DPS you'd be sacrificing in exchange for greater AoE potential. So let's go ahead and get started. Now we'll try to narrate throughout the parse if I screw up or anything like that. We will not be doing Power of the Light here. Here I am doing Carve and then right into Maarselok, the bash. So the Carve, bash, like so. I do recommend rebinding bash to a different key if you are on PC. That way you don't have to worry about blocking, which you might end up losing out on a regen tick. Which doesn't seem like much, but it does end up being a little bit better for your sustain here. Now we are running Lokkestiiz on the front bar, so we do want to be careful that we are activating our synergies on the front bar here. Again, biting jabs is a channel, and so channel abilities are a little bit tricky to deal with, because you can't dash in the middle of a channel, then you end up losing your some of your biting jabs DPS. You can't do potions, you can't activate synergies while you're in the channel animation. So be very close attention to when your potion cooldowns happen, when your synergies are activated, so you're able to time them. This is one of the reasons why we're doing Maarselok after Carve rather than after, for example, jabs or something. So you can see here with Power of the Light gone, it actually becomes a much more static rotation here. Very easy to maintain overall. The only thing that's kind of dynamic is where you end up dropping Trap, but other than that, everything else remains pretty static here. Dropping Power of the Light gets you an additional Biting Jabs cast, which is sometimes going to be worth it. In this instance, it usually ends up being worth it here. Kind of see a little bit of weird interaction there with the synergy and biting jab that does sometimes happen. Especially the synergy like Shards here has an animation associated with it. So we're getting a little bit close to execute time here, which is going to be around 25% health remaining. At which point we'll swap it over to Executioner. So instead of running biting jabs now, we're going to be running just Executioner instead. This does not have a channel time associated with it, so you will be able to just spam it. Still going to be running Carves, still making sure we are Maarselok bashing. And if you want to drop Restoring Focus and Execute, you certainly can as well. So there we go. That is the amount of DPS you can expect to pull on your two-handed build here. So about 3k or so lower, 83.3k overall DPS. So in terms of the Burning Light DPS, it's down here. Again, I tried using Wrecking Blow, and while Wrecking Blow does end up doing a little bit more DPS than Jabs does in terms of ability versus ability, the Burning Light passive is what makes the difference. So without biting jabs, we have no way of proccing Burning Light outside of running something like Blazing Spear, which ends up dropping our overall DPS with Wrecking Blow. So that's why we were using biting jabs for that additional 3k DPS or so from Burning Light. Well, that is pretty much it for this build video. Hopefully you guys found this informative. If you guys have any questions about the build, feel free to ask them in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.